So before we resume with my non-binary response to ContraPoints video cancelling, I just wanted to take some time to respond to some common issues taken with my last video. If you haven't seen my previous video, I would suggest doing so before watching this one. Being able to respond like this is one of the benefits of working sections. It gives me a chance to respond directly to criticism received. Starting first of all with charges that I'm just extending drama. A rather ironic sentiment considering this ambiguous car wreck.
I do still want to talk about why people cancel and the effect that it's having, but it looks like there's going to have to be a part 2, Gorge, because I have hit my limit. So why don't we all cut our losses and try again in 2020,
Every time I listen to that, I come away with a different interpretation of what she means and whether or not she intends of making a follow-up or not, or if she's threatening to do so. It's not conveyed that well. But that aside, there's something that needs to be said. Natalie does not get to hurt the non-binary community, publish a video on the matter failing to actually address some of the issues whilst making it worse in many regards, and then call for everyone to stop responding. And neither do her fans. This isn't a playground game of tag. Natalie has genuinely hurt many of us, more so following the publishing of this video. As for getting people to care, that was on me. In my previous video, I sort of assumed that people would like to know how Natalie had left out key elements. Elements relating to both her model case study and why people have been criticising her. Since nowhere does Buck Angel's open support for failed comedian turned transphobic Twitter personality Graham Linehan ever get mentioned. Yet people still came at me, accusing me of fragmenting the leftist movement for no reason. And to that I respond, great, because what a lot of people defending Natalie using this line of rhetoric don't seem to understand is the fact that non-binary folk are people as well, that we deserve to be respected as people, that our concerns should be listened to as people. Currently you want the non-binary community to supply warm bodies to your cause, and yet you're not willing to hear us out as people when your chosen special has caused us harm. You want us to not only supply you the labour of our time and bodies, but you expect us to do so whilst being abused by people who are meant to be our comrades. And to that I say, no. Any movement which is reliant upon grinding down some of its most marginalised members does not deserve to survive. You don't have the right to demand that we suffer in silence so you can live your fucking fantasy of a clean revolution. And if you believe otherwise, I ask you this. How are you any different to business owners who feel so entitled to running a business that they'll argue in favour of human misery to prop it up? Because, in truth, there is no difference. They see human misery as justifiable for their capitalistic fantasy. You see it as justifiable for your revolutionary fantasy. And that can fuck right off. If you want our time and our labour, you will damn well treat us like people. You will damn well listen to our concerns right now, not promise to do so later. If we're doing this at all, then we'll be doing it shoulder to shoulder, side by side. Not following behind with a bucket collecting your shit. Now the last criticism I'd like to respond to are the charges that my video is far too long. Something which reveals more about the problem the left has with marginalised voices. I mean, just think about it. Natalie made a feature-length video complaining about how she's being held responsible for her actions. Something that's being held as a masterpiece, worthy of praise. Yet non-binary people talking on the very fact of how what Natalie has done to them is harmful and how she's dishonestly framing the narrative? That's a chore. In a just world, these things would be viewed as the other way round. But we don't live in a just world. We live in one that has a habit of treating marginalised voices that don't stroke the ego of the status quo like toxic waste. So moving back to Natalie's video, this is a section in which she finally starts to address the controversy surrounding opulence. The main problem of which is the fact that Natalie pretends like everything that's happened up to now was solely the response to Buck's 10-second appearance, which just isn't true. Yes, there's a problem that Natalie, the sole conduit for many cis people to the thoughts and feelings of the trans community, goes ahead and includes a man who has not only outed trans women, but has argued in favour of medical gatekeeping to the extent that people like Graham Linehan see him as an ally, a feeling Buck completely reciprocates. Reminder, Graham Linehan is a man who mere months before Buck began openly supporting him, targeted funding designated for a trans youth support charity, something Linehan did because he believes organisations such as Mermaids are turning children into fake transgender people, i.e. turning them into trans trenders. So when cis people see Natalie including Buck as a guest voice in her video, they think that this is a good example of a trans person. If they then go on to follow Buck and see a support for a very toxic narrative about children being turned transgender, something that disproportionately impacts non-binary people, they'll likely go ahead and see this as appropriate behaviour. And that's a problem. So by including Buck Angel, you have, intentionally or not, implied that outing trans women as a means of seeking revenge and vocally supporting the targeting of vital trans youth resources is acceptable behaviour. And yet, that wasn't the end of the conversation. The fact is, in spite of having all this information supplied to her by non-binary people who felt hurt by Buck's inclusion the moment the video went out, Natalie went on to celebrate it 2 days later. She didn't remove herself from the conversation to take time to think. She ignored the smoke that was starting to build and continued to act as if everything was fine. The fact is, it's even worse when we take into account what Natalie says in her video.
Now, I was aware at the time that trans Twitter hated Buck Angel, but my thinking was, well, trans Twitter kind of hates every trans celebrity, and they certainly hate me, so I wasn't going to let that stop me. Little did I know quite how vicious things were about to get.
So it's not like Natalie can claim ignorance. She knew there was an issue, yet rather than investigate to see what the problems were, Natalie decided to discredit the experiences and feelings of not just many non-binary people, but many binary trans people out of hand. Because here's the thing people need to understand about Buck's outing of Lana Wachowski. This is not ancient history. This happened in 2006 and was the subject of articles for years to come. Because that's what happens when you out someone like Lana Wachowski. Anytime they work on a new film or project, anytime there's increased traffic relating to their name, that is one of the things that'll come up. People who were in their mid-teens when this happened are now in their 30s. And many of them have opened up about the fact that seeing Buck's Rolling Stone interview caused them to retreat further into the closet because they saw the abuse Buck Angel opened Lana Wachowski up to. It borders on shared trauma. Trauma well within living memory. And to add salt to wound, when Natalie did finally decide to apologise, and I put that word in captions, it was behind a paywall and took a form that seemed more like an attack on the people she'd hurt, as well as those who had, at the time, listened to what we had to say. So to reduce it down to a 10-second clip at this point is incredibly reductionist and trivialising, and shows that Natalie hasn't bothered to listen to actual voices on the subject. So when Natalie throws out the claim that,
and I'm happy to hear the perspective of non-binary people who don't trust him, because I totally get where they're coming from and I think that's valid.
No, you don't. If you did, you wouldn't have just admitted to writing off our concerns out of hand, literally 5 minutes ago. Now, one of the excuses Natalie brings up is the account of Buck's age, 57 at the time of recording, claiming that this explains many of the issues he has, such as supporting vocal transphobes whose entire deal is targeting trans youth support charities. Context which becomes more important when we read the thread in which Buck Angel very openly goes on to state that the gender-affirmative approach of care for young trans people is, quote, child abuse, end quote. Thanking a transphobic parent for spouting shit about the mythological, rapid onset gender dysphoria. And this is all the way back in August. Practically 3 centuries ago. And it's not like Buck has changed. Mere days before Natalie went ahead and posted her video, Buck was very vocally mocking people who believe trans people don't need to be medically diagnosed with gender dysphoria to be trans, showing behaviour comparable to other scumbags such as Ricky Gervais. Fact is, I reject the excuse on grounds of age entirely. For a start, non-binary people are not a new thing, and if articles such as the Bisexual Manifesto published in the year of 1990 can get with it, so too can Buck Angel. This is just the same old tired excuse as, ignore your father's racism, he's just a product of his time. Well, here's the thing about that. People aren't static products of their time. We grow and mature until we're 6 feet under. I mean, if Buck can figure out how to use Twitter, he can damn well figure out how to stop being such a shitbag to entire portions of the trans community. So excusing bigoted behaviour on grounds of age is just another lazy way of hand-waving criticism. The same for bringing up past good deeds.
But I also respect the decades of good activism Buck Angel has done for trans people, and I am grateful to him for that. And in light of that, I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt about where his heart is, and express my criticism in a more measured way than just attacking who he is as a person. But Twitter needs to establish that he's a horrible person, because this is the strategy they've chosen to establish that I am a horrible person.
That last bit, by the way, is what I was referring to in my last video when I mentioned that I hadn't cancelled Natalie for some invented reason. None of us were starting from the desire to paint Natalie bad, therefore let's paint Buck bad as a means to an end. People raised issue of Buck's inclusion because of the harm he's caused the community. I'm not some black and white person who is completely shut off to the idea that outing is ever appropriate. Most commonly people debate this subject in relation to outing vocally anti-LGBT+ politicians. People putting into place policies that would hurt the community as a whole. It's still violence, but it's arguably justifiable violence. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that he outed a trans woman as a means of personal revenge. The result of which was that many in the trans community were made to feel like they needed to hide more than ever. That they couldn't trust other trans people, let alone cis people. In this regard, Buck's actions are much closer to the harm caused by an anti-LGBT+ politician than the dirty, but arguably necessary actions of an LGBT+ advocate. And you coming out and mentioning the good his presence has apparently had is, well, it's a bit of a fuck you to the many people who have suffered as a result of his actions. It's like turning up to a murder trial and lamenting over the fact that the accused never forgot to send his parents birthday cards, complaining about the fact that the trial is only focusing on the negative. Hey, Contra's the one who kept conflating legal and social repercussions. Another interesting thing is the way in which Natalie recalls the fact that on Reddit, people had apparently asked her why Buck Angel was used for her video to voice a quote by John Walters, rather than John Walters himself, during which she presents the appearance of at least one of them as absolute necessity.
A bunch of people on my subreddit were like, why couldn't she just get John Waters to do those lines? Well, first of all, I don't actually know John, but I just have a feeling he would write me off as some kind of tranny millennial SJW. Like, why is Buck Angel canceled, but John Waters isn't? Well, because trans Twitter does not know who John Waters is, and let's try to keep it that way. Except
this is a false dichotomy. Buck Angel and John Walters are not the last two men on this planet. So, I find it weird that this was brought up. Thing is, Natalie has to do this because, as noted earlier, she admits to knowing there was an issue. So acknowledging the fact that she has options in the men she picks for the role, well, that opens up all sorts of problems regarding erring on the side of caution. So it's better to pretend like it had to be one of the two. And since she doesn't know the other, well, it had to be Buck. There was just no other way. Now, to be fair to Natalie, up to this point she has been primarily focusing on Buck's true scum allegations, admitting that he's clearly not supportive of non-binary people, and claiming she has an issue with that, but ignoring important elements such as his public support for Graham Linehan entirely, pretending like the only issue is with the fact that Buck uses the word transsexual to distinguish himself from others. This isn't something I've added post hoc to try and catch her out. I and many others tweeted on this, enough that I don't buy the fact that Natalie is not aware of it. I could of course be very wrong, but I think it unlikely with just how hard she had to hunt for some of the tweets she goes on to share later on, going so far as to show ones that were posted by people who had her blocked. And this is something that Natalie seems to suggest in her video.
And that's my disagreement with Buck. It's not that he invalidates non-binary identities, because I don't really see him doing that. And if he was doing that, I would have seen it, because for the last 2 months, a lot of people have been doing nothing but sending me problematic Buck Angel tweets.
So why then has she ignored the facts that Buck Angel not only pretends like we've got a problem where people are receiving surgery without proper support, coded for diagnosis of gender dysphoria, but actually goes so far as to publicly defend the man who targeted a trans youth charity, an act carried out very specifically on the basis that said charity was turning British youth into transgenders. The only reason I can think is because Natalie knows that bringing it up would be the end of her, that even her stans would see a problem in this behaviour if she were to acknowledge it. Me? Well, they can discount me because they've been sold a very toxic narrative about my apparent motives, that I'm apparently acting in bad faith, setting out to destroy Natalie and will lie about her and by proxy Buck in any way to do so. Which is how we finally come to the part where Natalie opens up on Buck's outing of Lana Wachowski. Which, I have to be honest about, is the part that forced me to stop watching her video initially because of just how underhanded Natalie was in this section. So with that noted, let's go on to see what she had to say. It's about to get rough.
And if the true scum allegation isn't strong enough to prove it, oh, they have other pieces of evidence to fall back on to hold up their conclusion. For example, here's a tweet claiming, Natalie's trying so fucking hard to make it sound like the only thing Buck Angel ever did was write a few iffy tweets, and that's just so fucking far from the truth. Dude launched a targeted tabloid harassment campaign outing a trans woman against her will with the specific intent of causing her physical, emotional, and professional harm. The shorter way of saying that is that he wanted to make her suffer, and she very well could have been killed. Yikes. This ain't it, Chief. Friendly reminder that this isn't a good look. Maybe don't try to get trans women killed? Disappointing. It sounds pretty serious. Let's investigate. Here's what I've managed to piece together. Scene 1. The year is 2003. Los Angeles, where the movie world, the porn world, and the BDSM scene come together in a tale of heartbreak, betrayal, and transsexualism. La La Land. Dramatis personae. Buck Angel, transsexual porn star. Ilsa Strix, dominatrix, then wife of Buck Angel. Lana Wachowski, wildly successful director of The Matrix, at the time not yet out as a transgender woman. The synopsis is that Ilsa Strix and Buck Angel's marriage ended after Ilsa had an affair with Lana Wachowski, who was not yet out as trans. So Buck was understandably upset about the affair and, in what seems like a petty act of revenge, told a series of magazines that this celebrity director Wachowski was a cross-dresser who had stolen his wife, which I guess was the information he had at the time. So, is that outing a trans woman against her will? Well, in retrospect, it seems like it, though that may not be what he thought he was doing at the time. But to really get to the bottom of this, we have to do some digging. We have to trawl through the dirty details of trans people's personal histories, which I've noticed is one of the internet's favorite activities. So I actually went on eBay and I purchased Rolling Stone issue 991, January 2006, and I'm finally able to reveal that the seller canceled the order. God damn it. But I was finally able to track down and translate a Spanish version of the Rolling Stone article from the Wayback Machine, and I'm finally able to expose the truth. Stop. Freeze exactly where you are. Take a look at yourself and what all of us have been doing for the last 30 seconds. Who does this behavior remind you of? If your answer is social justice advocates fighting for trans equality, you are incorrect. If your answer is creepy stalkers who hate trans people, I am very suspicious of anyone whose online behavior prompts me to dig through articles full of dead names and sordid scandals involving trans people from almost 2 decades ago. This is very similar to techniques used against trans people by internet fascists. So I'm pretty suspicious of anyone pushing this kind of investigation. How can you tell the difference between a trans anarcho-socialist with an anime avatar and a Nazi pretending to be a trans anarcho-socialist with an anime avatar? Well, you can't. Anonymous is anonymous is anonymous, whether it's on 4chan or Twitter. So unless Buck Angel, Ilsa Strix, or Lana Wachowski gets in touch with me and lets me know that for some unimaginable reason they want me to publicly dig up their 17-year-old divorce drama, this is none of my fucking business. And it's none of yours either, so shut up and go back to kiwi farms where you belong.
Honestly, it doesn't matter how many times I watch this segment. All it keeps coming back to is the fact that Natalie is an awful excuse for a human being. How I feel this section suggests she's well beyond redemption by this point. So let's unpack why. Starting with the way that she pretends like taking issue with multiple things someone has done is some sort of conspiracy. The truth, meanwhile, is that we as human beings are capable of thinking in more than binary, in more than black and white. And a part of that is the ability to consider multiple factors across a period of time. So, for example, Buck's true scum nature, as well as the fact that he's more than happy to weaponize outing, an incredibly violent act that should only be turned to in the most extreme circumstances, if at all, but in his case, for petty revenge. We can also consider the fact that Buck rejects all responsibility for his actions in regards to these things, how he's never sought to make amends for the shitty things he's done, instead gaslighting the people he's harmed by telling them that they're actually mad at themselves and are just projecting their anger onto him. An incredibly toxic mentality that we will be coming back to later on. Don't you worry. Moving on, we have the fact that Natalie just honestly pretends like a very public outing which took place 14 years ago and has been part of social commentary ever since is akin to some far-off historic event. She makes it sound like it came from the 17th century. It's just not. There are copies of the original article available on forums to this very day, one of which I found within 10 minutes of googling Buck Angel outed Lana and 3 clicks of the mouse. I was later sent an archived copy via Twitter, confirming the authenticity of the one shared on the forum. So hardly lost knowledge, but Natalie sets herself an unreasonable standard of finding a printed copy of the article before turning around and accusing people who know how to use a search engine of acting like fascists, before outright insinuating that they could be fascists. And we'll come back to that in the next video. But first, I wanted to tackle this disgusting idea that Buck has some twisted right to privacy on the topic. Buck sold any right to privacy he had the moment he sold his story to the Rolling Stone and Associated Press. Buck chose to out Lana, who at the time was publicly denying earlier rumors that she was changing gender because she didn't feel safe enough coming out. So it was a public act of violence, and now that nearly everybody who knows what happened hates his guts for it, Natalie wants to turn around and pretend like it's a private matter? It's fucking disgusting. It's the same as apologia surrounding marital rape and domestic abuse. This idea that it's a private matter and therefore the public has no business condemning the abuser. Except this time the act of violence was witnessed and documented publicly. I mean, could you imagine if, say, Chris Brown had been recorded giving Rihanna a black eye, only for his fans to turn around and claim that it was a private matter? Well, that's what Natalie is doing. Because, let's be honest, Lana wasn't the only target of the article. Yes, Buck was sharing that information to hurt her, but he was also sharing it and other information to hurt his ex-wife, Karen Winslow, Ilza Strix. And unlike Natalie's wild and dishonest speculation about the motives and actions of her critics, her defense of this is shown by the very existence of this segment in her video. Going out of your way to inflict harm on your ex-spouse and their new partner is a textbook form of domestic abuse, which, for those who may not know, does extend to former partners. You don't own the people you're with, regardless of whether you're monogamous or not. If they move on, that's their damn right. And if you go out of your way to hurt them, it was the right damn move. Now, some of you might argue that I'm being hyperbolic here and comparing what Buck Angel did to domestic abuse. So, let's consider what they actually did. In the Rolling Stones article, Buck Angel goes out of his way to describe Lana in vulnerable situations in great detail, giving every tantalizing bit of information about what Lana was wearing, right down to her underwear. It was not a passing mention that the interviewer honed in on and blew up. It was Buck's focus at various points in the article. This was private stuff, information Buck decided to share as a means of lashing out at both Lana and Karen. a fact confirmed by the way he later trash talks their relationship. This is even though friends at the time describe a completely different story. Now, I'd argue that what we're witnessing here is effectively a version of revenge porn from a pre-smartphone era, because whilst the contents differ, the act and the intended result are much the same. For those who don't know, revenge porn is an act of domestic abuse whereby someone releases private nude or partially nude photos of another person with the explicit intent to cause them harm. Sharing materials of others in such a vulnerable state without their permission can have devastating psychological ramifications due to public response. Much in the same way that Buck releasing private information about Lana Wachowski did. One only has to read the Rolling Stone article itself to see the way it starts to psychoanalyze Lana's person, or the comments on the forum page from 2006 where the article was mirrored to see this. Buck is a vindictive ex who was incapable of moving on from his failed relationship, and thus set out to do as much harm as possible to both Lana and Karen with the approaching debut of V for Vendetta. Now, some people might say that this is simply part of the Hollywood scene, and whilst, yes, this sort of gossip happens, that doesn't then mean it's perceived as acceptable, especially when it comes to the whole BDSM scene. There, more than many other communities, privacy and discretion is a given. Hence, some politicians feel secure enough to partake in such activities, as Buck acknowledges. Privacy is fundamental to the scene. But we also gain a simple refutation to this argument with, quote, "Many friends of Ilza and Lana refuse to speak of them. They want their privacy respected," says Sabrina Belladonna, a leading Los Angeles dominatrix who knew Karen Winslow for years before hanging up the telephone. "Otherwise, they would have made a public statement, don't you think?" End quote. As well as the later quote, "The Wachowskis' tight-knit group remains protective." Sound designer Davis says, "Nothing about their personal lives is anybody else's fucking business. The work and working relationships aren't impacted at all, except by the distraction and disappointment in our species." End quote. Wow, okay. Harsh but justified. I feel that way a lot. So many of the other people contacted by Peter Wilkinson, the journalist behind the article, felt that the questions being asked were invasive. So it was the scene or it was the time period? Don't work as arguments here. The very fact that people from the scene at the time put their foot down and told Wilkinson no is very clear evidence of this. We also need to keep in mind the time frame. The article was published in the year 2006, just as a movie co-written by Lana Wachowski was about to debut. Yet, if you remember what Natalie said in her video, all the events took place around 2002 to 2003. Buck had even remarried by the end of 2003. This was not an immediate response to being left for. This was a calculated power move. I mean, compare his actions to Thea Bloom, Lana's ex-wife. She didn't out Lana in 2002 when they separated, a fact the article acknowledges, with quote, "Lana has been extremely dishonest with me in our personal life, and I believe she is hiding information from me regarding our financial affairs," said Bloom in an affidavit. The split, she said, was based on very intimate circumstances concerning which I do not elaborate at this time for reasons of her personal privacy. End quote. So the cis woman who went through the same thing as Buck Angel knew to respect Lana's privacy. So what's his excuse? Buck literally sat on the information he had, waiting until he saw the exact right moment to maximize the damage he could do by sharing Lana's story. Not a hard thing to do when one of your targets is a well-known director/screenwriter. So any excuse along the lines of poor old Buck being heartbroken, an excuse that wouldn't justify domestic abuse even if he had done it shortly after his divorce, they can doubly fuck off. Now once I had this thought, I started to wonder, is this site discussed in LGBT+ discourse surrounding domestic abuse? Surely I can't be the first to recognise this for what it is. And as it turns out, I'm not. There is pre-existing queer discourse surrounding using the threat of outing to control someone. So actually using it to go ahead and hurt them? That's not some massive step. So now we begin to recognise the fact that Buck's actions weren't just violent on account of outing a trans person, they were domestically abusive. And I get that our understanding of domestic abuse has advanced since the early 2000s, hence the victims of Buck's actions might not even realise that what he did was domestically abusive. The point is, I don't give a fuck. To my knowledge, Buck Angel has never admitted fault over what he did, has never tried to make amends. In fact, he still seems to revel in what he did. However, now that we know the details, do we perhaps see why Natalie was so damn desperate to derail the conversation at all costs? I really have to wonder, did she not read the article like she pretends, or did she read it online and just want to avoid it? This is even though the information is publicly available thanks to Buck Angel and a part of our shared trans history. Well, I think she does so because defending someone who not only outed a trans woman but did so as an act of domestic abuse, well, that's too much for even her to joke her way out of. So yeah, this is why I'm questioning whether Natalie is simply gone at this point. Like, it's possible that she just hasn't realised the full extent of what she's defending. Hell, I didn't until I started to think more about the way in which Buck acted. You see, I'd mostly focused on it from the outing angle to the point that I'd been blinded to the relationship angle between Buck and Karen. So it is possible. But unless Natalie immediately changes course, that's it. I'm just done with her. Now we'll come back to the way Natalie frames her critics in the next video when discussing the larger section in which she shares the tweets she found, many of which were hidden from her behind a block or were removed within 3 hours of being posted, followed by a public apology. Because, according to Natalie, if you have to go out of your way to track things down, that's the same as an angry mob at your door, readying the guillotine. But for now, let's move on to Natalie's explanation of her repeated behaviour, which a sizable portion of the non-binary community has deemed an issue. How Natalie switches from telling us that going back and looking at what actually happened makes us fascists, to being something that a responsible and fair person should do. Now in this section, Natalie goes on to share a load of tweets, including the one of Buck calling affirmative care child abuse, and pretends like a load of tweets to which the context for many of them is pretty clear, isn't valid evidence to critique Buck's behaviour and Natalie's promotion of him, effectively declaring Twitter off limits to criticism. Convenient as she then goes on to compare his case to hers, going so far as to state the following.
And if the person defends me or argues back in any way, they say, I can't believe you're ignoring the valid concerns of marginalized people. You know, they're weaponizing their marginalized status as trans people to isolate and attack another trans person.
Except no, that's not what typically happens. The go-to defense of Natalie throughout this entire conversation has been to accuse non-binary people of being hypersensitive and declaring that all of this is pointless drama. The number of people I've had to block for saying this shit is extortionate, and that is trivializing. That is ignoring genuine concerns. And the fact is, you admitted to being sold this narrative earlier in your video.
And then a few months ago, when I was feeling angry and miserable and despised over another time I was being cancelled by trans Twitter, we'll get to that one later, I saw this post from Buck on Instagram. Dear beautiful human being, I see your pain. It is okay that you lash out at me. You do this because I am you and you are reflecting your self-hate to me. I am strong and will be here for you forever and no matter what. This is my intention as a human being, to help others. Love, Buck Angel. And then the caption, suffering. That is why the trans community lashes out at each other. I am very aware of the hate towards me by some in the community. They hate on me and others because they are hurt. And those were exactly the words I needed to hear at that moment. So I commented a heart and then Buck DM'd me and he said, I love you. And I was like, senpai noticed me. And so I said, I love you back.
So for those of you at the back, Buck effectively sold Natalie the lie that all the criticism she was receiving from within the trans community was not as the result of her actions. Instead, it was the result of trans people, more specifically non-binary people, hating themselves and projecting said hatred onto both Natalie and Buck, completely alleviating them of all responsibility for their actions. This is why we feel like we haven't been listened to. This is why we feel like our concerns are being ignored, and that is making us even angrier. Yes, Natalie goes on to make some apologies in a second, Apologies which, for some parts, come a year after what actually took place. But much like the earlier apology being hidden behind a paywall, these apologies are hidden behind 40 minutes of Natalie talking absolute crap about the situation and how she's apparently being cancelled. Going so far as to draw into question our motives, tell us what we think, and compare our actions to literal fascists before insinuating that we might just be fascists. And she wonders why people have a hard time accepting her apologies. So let's move on to a breakdown of regularly cited tweets and how she feels about them and the criticism they've received.
Here's the 3 tweets that I usually see scrapbooked together as definitive proof that I hate non-binary people. This is the first one, from September 2018. Notice how it's taken out of context from the thread, so you can't even see what I'm talking about. I'm sure this is not the experience of many NBs. NB means non-binary people. I leave it to them to articulate what NB existence looks like in a binary world. I do not and I cannot speak for them, but surely an account that begins and ends with "I'm not a man because I don't identify as one" is pretty weak. Okay, when I wrote the Twitter thread that tweet has been clipped out of, I was defending myself from accusations that my most recent video at the time, The Aesthetic, was anti-non-binary. In that video, there's a character named Justine who defends a version of the performativity theory of gender. But still, some people on Twitter were saying that the character Justine is a transmedicalist, and because she maybe wins the fictional debate in the video, I, Natalie Wynn, am therefore a transmedicalist. Here's the thing though, the performativity theory of gender, the one that Justine defends in that video, is conceptually as far away from transmedicalism as it is possible to be. Transmedicalism says that trans identity is biological, it's neurological, it's hormonal, it's diagnosable and treatable, whereas performativity says that gender is gesture, it's expression, it's performance, it's a social phenomenon. Performativity makes no reference to gender dysphoria or to any kind of medical concept at all. So whereas transmedicalism is a kind of bioessentialism, performativity is a kind of social constructionism. So these are exact opposite theories of gender.
Whilst in theory that might work, in practice we see a very different picture. The fact is, theory aside, gender presentation is used as a litmus test for gender dysphoria, something I've seen in action with a trans woman I knew back in university. She was a grease and jeans mechanic, someone who never wore a dress or appeared especially feminine. However, she hit a roadblock when she went to start surgery and change her birth certificate. Namely, her doctor refused to sign off on them on grounds that they didn't believe she had gender dysphoria. Why? Well, because everything they understood about gender dysphoria related back to this idea of gender presentation. They took my friend's dislike for dresses and heavy makeup as a sign that, really, they were just confused. That they didn't really have gender dysphoria and therefore weren't really trans. So whilst I can see where you're coming from, you have to realise that this is a lived experience of many binary and non-binary trans people seeking any sort of medical support or birth certificate change. Whilst your argument takes place in a more abstract philosophical realm, the lines become much more blurred in real life. But moving on to the tweet and my issues with it, have you ever heard the phrase, "nothing someone says before the word but really counts"? You start out well, explaining how it's not really your place to speak on the experiences of non-binary people, yet you then go on to insert your thoughts on our arguments specifically relating to our legitimacy as people. I could understand if you relay the experiences of non-binary people, but you don't do that. Instead, whack, have my unsolicited opinion. Something that's not exactly improved even when we do consider the full thread, which is something I did read at the time. Yet I was still disappointed. But back then I gave you the benefit of the doubt. Lastly, I just like to tackle this idea that we need definitive proof of anything. I mean, you know how dog whistles work. You know how bigots try to play that line of do they, don't they to keep people guessing. The truth is, all we can do is share what we know and let others decide whether it's too much of a coincidence that this happens time and time again.
Okay, again we're mid-thread with missing context, but the tweet says, whereas I've met 20-year-olds in full-on boy mode who are like, "Hi, I'm a trans woman, she, her pronouns." So I guess by including this tweet in the ContraPoints is problematic collage, people are implying that I don't think it's valid for someone who presents male to identify as a woman and request she/her pronouns. Well, that's not true. I was surprised when I first experienced this, but I think it's valid.
Sorry to say, but I think Natalie misses the issue with this one. Yes, there are problems with the usage of boy mode as a descriptor of someone who uses she/her pronouns, especially considering that this is Natalie, not a character played by Natalie. But what's more important to me is the fact that you follow this up with discourse about generational differences in understanding. This is even though you only began transitioning very recently, and as you yourself go on to note, you aren't much older than the rest of us. Fact is, this is a reoccurring theme throughout your tweets. You partake in this generational othering, something you'll later go on to acknowledge is an issue since you seem to be implying that non-binary or non-assimilationist trans people are a new phenomenon. If you don't know what an assimilationist is, and thereby what a non-assimilationist is, allow me to explain. An assimilationist is someone who believes marginalized people, such as LGBT+ people, people of color, or autistic people, must seek to mimic the status quo. That LGBT+ people must act straight or live within strict gender roles. That a black person must act white, or that a neurodivergent person must act neurotypical. Fact is, this has never been the only philosophy of the queer community. The very word queer was proclaimed back in the 80s and 90s as a direct rebuke to this demand when it came to the LGBT+ community. In response to the AIDS scare, which increased homophobic violence, large portions of the community adopted the term to effectively say, so what if we're different? We still deserve to live.
Okay, mid-thread, no context once again. But now you go into these leftist Discord/Facebook groups and like 20 to 30% identify as some flavor of trans. Most of them are not conventional binary transsexuals. That seems to be the future. Okay, well, it's true that many leftist Discord servers are like this. But reading this back, I don't like the way the phrase conventional binary transsexuals is hitting my ear. I can see how it could imply that non-binary identities are somehow newfangled, which isn't true. There's been non-binary people for longer than there's been medical transsexuals, in fact, so we'll call this a bad tweet. I apologize for tweeting it, and I apologize to any non-binary people who felt trivialized by it.
And that's good. But link the lesson you just learned to your previous tweet talking about generational differences, because it also implies that non-binary and non-assimilationist trans people are some new phenomenon. It feeds this narrative that this is something new, something trending. This issue is something that seems to come up time and time again.
Okay, this is the big one. This tweet got its own article in the fucking Guardian. You know, I really wish people would pay less attention to the tweets I spend 30 seconds rating and a little more attention to the videos that I spend, hundreds of hours making. Anyway, let's look at the tweet. This is the most scrutinized paragraph I've ever written, and it's so mediocre. This has happened to me before in hyper-woke spaces. Like it's me and a bunch of cis women, and we all have to go in a circle saying she, her because I'm there. There's this paradox where I can go to a sports bar in North Carolina and be miss-ma'amed all night, no question. But in self-consciously trans-inclusive spaces, I have to explain my pronouns and watch woke people awkwardly correct themselves every time they say, you guys. I guess it's good for people who use they, them only and want only gender-neutral language, but it comes at the minor expense of semi-passable transes like me, and that's super fucking hard for us. So people interpreted this tweet as me being against the practice of sharing pronouns, which I'm literally just not. Like, I've actually been the person who initiates the pronoun circle many times. The backstory of this tweet is basically that I once got triggered in a situation where I was with a bunch of cis women and we all had to go around saying our pronouns, and like a typical triggered tranny, I tiptoed over to Twitter to tip-tap type it out. But here's the thing, by the end of this thread, I had already talked myself away from the initial frustration I was expressing. If you know my videos and my voice, then you know me saying it comes at the minor expense of semi-passable transes, and that's super fucking hard for us, is sarcastic. It's a minor expense. It's not actually very hard for us, Gorge. It's fine. But people on Twitter don't watch my videos and they don't get sarcasm. So People flipped out over this. I was getting dragged.
Rather than us not getting sarcasm, could the lashback have been the result of the simple facts that sarcasm doesn't translate well to text? Do you also understand how it was sarcasm, it was satire, it was a joke, are very often used to allow someone to say something but not be held responsible for what they say? Now, my main issue with this at the time was the fact that Natalie completely centers herself here. Not just in being inconvenienced, but also the fact that she assumes the only reason people do this is because, well, she's there. Because, of course, she doesn't know whether these spaces do the pronoun circle when she's not there. The fact is, said practice should be the default. Why? Well, because it's impossible to tell if a non-binary or hell, even a binary trans person is present. Putting aside non-binary and non-assimilationist binary trans people, those that do seek to present as stereotypically in line with their gender may not have taken their first step. In fact, going to such a group may be their first step. And for them, it can be important to have that opportunity. Fact is, Natalie continues.
And I made the poor decision to try to solve the tweet problem with more tweeting, which 100% of the time is like trying to put out a fire with lighter fluid. So me and my dumb brain did another short thread trying to clarify what I was saying and defending my right to talk about my own experiences. That didn't make things any better, so in a state of anger and frustration, I tweeted out yet another thread. And this time, I said some truly stupid things, including the now infamous line, "I sometimes feel like the last of the old school transsexuals." I honestly don't know what the fuck I was even trying to say. I don't feel like the last of the old school transsexuals. I don't even know what that means. I guess I basically meant that offline, I don't have any radical aspirations. You know, I want to be inconspicuous. I want to blend in. And that's what I meant by old school. You know, I want people to assume my pronouns. You know, it's funny because it is very different from the way I am online, where I'm totally shameless and open. But offline, I'm an inconspicuous pussy, like a total coward. So, this was a rage thread, and I apologize for tweeting it.
Now here's the problem with this. Natalie never acknowledges the issue. Again, she claims she doesn't know what she was saying. But looking back on her older tweets talking about how things have moved on from conventional binary transsexuals and how she feels like there's a generational gap present between her and new non-binary, non-assimilationist trans people, we get a rather clear picture. Fact is, shortly after apologizing for one account of this, Natalie goes right ahead and does it again in this video as she attempts to explain what she meant, once more suggesting that non-passing trans people, binary or not, are new. This is even though they're not. And here's what Natalie has to understand. We're not new. So the only real difference between older generations of trans people and newer ones are the way they treated us. To put frankly, a lot of older generations treated us like shit, and in the case of people like Buck Angel, still do. So when you say that you identify more with them, you seem to believe on some subconscious level that we are new, and that's what you mean. However, we as the audience watching who know that we're not new, and you've consciously admitted we're not new, we begin to look for other meanings behind what you're saying. And when those older generations have treated us like shit and you're defending one such person, do you see what we might start to conclude from those facts? If you want to fix this, you need to stop this generational othering you partake in and actively challenge the shit that comes with it. Those are my thoughts.
Let's go back to Buck Angel. I'm kind of a conscientious objector to the practice of condemning someone based on a collage of their worst tweets taken out of context.
So why don't you go over the context? As someone who tackles religious extremists all the time, the cries of out of context aren't exactly new. But here's the thing. Context can be displayed. This is what Natalie tried to do, yet sadly in my mind, she failed to do with some of her tweets. However, returning to Buck Angel, what is the context that makes vocally supporting Graham Linehan okay? What's the context that makes describing affirmative care for young trans people as child abuse whilst propping up the myth of rapid onset gender dysphoria okay? What's the context that makes laughing at self-ID okay? Fact is, we haven't even covered half of the stuff Buck Angel has said or done. During writing this video, I was sent a link to a pastebin which is well worth checking out. If I hadn't, I wouldn't have come across this tweet of Buck Angel falling for a hoax attack helicopter meme and using it as a thinly veiled excuse to attack existing non-binary genders, as well as roll out ableism to suggest that we're mentally ill and need to be fixed. And that is a tweet that is still up to this day. So what context makes that okay? Reminder that by having Buck Angel on as an honoured guest, Natalie is signalling to all her cis followers that Buck Angel, and by extension his public behaviour, is acceptable. That it's a valid part of discourse, or is at the very least, such a minor problem that it doesn't merit Natalie's attention regardless of how it hurts a non-binary audience. Saying out of context doesn't work as an argument unless you are able to show that context and argue how it's relevant in removing the issue. If you don't, it's just a buzz phrase which has been drained of all meaning, much like bad faith, drama, and allyship. Another thing is, Natalie pretends like all we have are the tweets when the only reason that's the case is because she refuses to engage with what Buck Angel has done in real life. So, we can't discuss Buck Angel and his real life actions. We can't discuss Buck Angel and his online actions. So what can we discuss? The issue is entirely self-inflicted by her. But there's more.
I do have anxiety about this. Like, I think I'm doing the right thing by not condemning Buck as true scum and evil, but I mean, I could be wrong. What if I am basically sacrificing myself for the sake of a person who really is as bad as Twitter says? Maybe tomorrow he'll tweet, "fuck non-binary people," and then I'll have fucked up. This whole thing is incredibly stressful to me. But I do believe that by refusing to participate in the anti-Buck Angel pile-on, I am erring on the morally safer side of things. Because even if he is a little true scummy, excommunicating him from the trans community is still probably not the best approach to take. In my experience, when people accept binary but not non-binary trans people, it usually takes like a 30-minute conversation to win them over to some level of non-binary acceptance.
Well, that's not our experience in the non-binary community as people who've been doing this their entire life. It's also not our experience with Buck Angel specifically, who has had all this stuff explained to him repeatedly, and he usually responds to people calling him out on his shit in the exact same way that alt-writers respond by claiming that they never said the J word. Also, I disagree. Not simply on account of the fact that you're prioritizing Buck's bigotry and possible redemption over the harm caused to non-binary people, but for the fact that not promoting and condemning are not the same thing. Buck didn't need to be a part of your video, and you didn't need to go out of your way to publicly thank him days after you were made aware of the issue. And yet you did it anyway. And that's what we're left with. Now, I want to draw this all back to the way Natalie first came into contact with Buck and why I think she's going to such extremes to either ignore the issues or actively misportray them. Because the verdict is still out there on which one I think she's partaking in. One moment she says something that makes me think she's deliberately fucking with us. The next she opens up and it seems like there's plausible reason for what's happening. Now, a lot of my thoughts go back to the thread in which she defended her video The Aesthetic. Having read the whole thread, I got a strong sense that Natalie had a lot of internalized transphobia, a lot of fears and concerns about her legitimacy as a trans woman, something which, on its own, is absolutely tragic. The problem, however, at least as I've seen it, emerges when she pushes that insecurity onto others, as seen in the statement about "I'm not a man because I don't identify as one" being weak. So I feel like rather than face that at the time and address it, she instead sought out excuses to alleviate her of the guilt she felt, which is where Buck came in. And now I get the sense that Natalie has built so much of her character on this idea that the response she received initially and with other problematic behaviours, that this isn't the result of her actions but the community projecting its self-loathing onto her. And I get the sense that she defends Buck because if he goes, a part of her is terrified that so too does this argument. This sort of anchoring is very interesting as a concept because I think it goes beyond Natalie, namely how I get the sense that many of her cis viewers are in turn tied up in her. They equate being a fan of ContraPoints with being a trans ally. So when people like me go after Buck's behaviour and Natalie responds negatively to that for her reason, this has a ripple effect which causes Natalie's cis viewers to lash out at us as well. The amount of vitriol targeted at me and others who have spoken out on the topic is pretty immense, all the way down to people seeking to do everything they can to invalidate my identity as a non-binary person, to either discredit what I say or to hurt me to such a degree that I'll leave their favourite waifu alone. And that's a major issue with her video. She does absolutely nothing to curb that response. Something that has had a dramatic effect on the non-binary and even general trans community these past couple of weeks, which is something we should go on to discuss in the next and hopefully final video in this non-binary breakdown. So hopefully I'll see you then. Now if you appreciate what myself and Adita do here on this channel, do know you can support us via Patreon. Your support gives us the funds to keep going and to keep putting out videos involving this level of research. You can also check out our other videos to see more of what we have to offer. So with that said, we'd just like to thank all of our Patreon sponsors, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Muck Gay, Wellington Marcus, Atlas5, and Sash Daniels. And for myself and Adita, take care now.